I don't care what your excuse is. You're disturbing the other customers. Get out of here immediately or I'll call security.
A disturbing? Ma'am, this is...
Theater staff kicked out, loud. Veteran with Tourette's, then Navy SEALs, cleared the building. Former Marine Corporal Jake Mitchell settled into his seat at Cineplex Theater for the 7:00 p.m. showing on Friday night, his combat-related Tourette syndrome already drawing annoyed stares from nearby moviegoers who saw only disruption, not the heroism that caused it. In 30 minutes, when 8 Navy SEALs witnessed his ejection, their team outing would become a lesson in respect. Jake, 26, appears to be an inconsiderate moviegoer whose vocal tics and involuntary movements annoy fellow patrons who can't understand that his neurological condition resulted from an IED blast that saved an entire SEAL team. His ticket stub and determination to enjoy normal activities conceal sacrifice that few civilians will ever comprehend. What happened in Theater 7 would expose how quickly civilian intolerance could be answered by military brotherhood and how one veteran's involuntary condition connected him to the warriors whose lives he'd saved through his own devastating injury. Cineplex Theater in Virginia Beach, Virginia, a popular multiplex near Naval Air Station Oceana that serves military families, active duty personnel, and civilians who rarely interact meaningfully with service members outside of patriotic holidays. The theater operates with typical corporate customer service standards that prioritize profit and crowd control over individual accommodation or understanding. The civilian entertainment environment often fails to recognize neurological disabilities as legitimate medical conditions, instead treating involuntary behaviors as deliberate disruptions requiring management rather than accommodation. Staff training focuses on maintaining quiet environments for paying customers without considering disability rights or the sacrifices that might have created those conditions. Recent social awareness campaigns about invisible disabilities have had minimal impact on actual business practices, where managers still prioritize complaining customers over disabled individuals whose conditions might seem voluntary to untrained observers. This setting represents the intersection where military sacrifice meets civilian ignorance, creating situations where heroes face discrimination from those they've protected. Jake enlisted in the Marines at 18 from rural Montana, serving as an explosive ordnance disposal specialist whose precise hands and steady nerves made him invaluable for defusing IEDs that threatened American forces. During his third deployment to Afghanistan in 2019, Jake was clearing a roadside bomb when his detector identified a secondary device positioned to kill first responders. He threw himself on the explosive to shield 8 Navy SEALs who were providing security, absorbing the blast that saved their lives while causing traumatic brain injury that resulted in severe Tourette's syndrome. Medically retired with full disability compensation, Jake lives alone while struggling with neurological condition that makes social interaction challenging despite his determination to maintain normal civilian activities. His Tourette's manifests through vocal tics, sudden movements, and involuntary sounds that draw negative attention from civilians who interpret his symptoms as behavioral problems rather than medical conditions requiring accommodation. Theater outings represent his attempt to reclaim normal life experiences, though each public appearance tests his emotional resilience against civilian reactions to his sacrifice-induced disability. Despite his neurological condition, Jake retains complete military bearing and tactical awareness that brain injury cannot erase. His Tourette's symptoms are unpredictable but manageable through medication and coping strategies that military medical training provided for combat-related neurological injuries. Jake's greatest strength is maintaining dignity, despite public reactions to his condition, using his experience to advocate for other wounded veterans, while pursuing the normal civilian activities that his sacrifice was meant to protect. His military identity provides psychological foundation for overcoming daily challenges that civilians cannot understand or appreciate. Jake must navigate civilian entertainment venues where his neurological condition triggers complaints from patrons who see disruption rather than disability, creating confrontations that test his right to public accommodation while highlighting civilian ignorance about combat-related injuries. The primary obstacle is civilian intolerance disguised as concern for other customers' enjoyment, preventing Jake from accessing basic entertainment services that his military sacrifice was intended to protect for all Americans, including himself. The stakes involve both personal dignity and broader disability rights. Jake's treatment influences how other veterans with neurological conditions are perceived and accommodated, while civilian reactions determine whether military sacrifice receives appropriate recognition and accommodation from businesses that benefit from such service. This conflict represents the challenge facing veterans whose invisible wounds make them targets for civilian discrimination, while their heroic service remains unknown to those whose entertainment they're accused of disrupting. Jake's decision to attend the Friday night movie represented his ongoing battle against the isolation that Tourette syndrome had imposed since his medical retirement, determined to reclaim the normal civilian experiences that his military service was meant to preserve for all Americans. "Just watch a movie like everyone else," Jake told himself while purchasing his ticket, knowing that his neurological condition would inevitably draw stares and complaints from civilians who couldn't understand that involuntary tics were medical symptoms rather than behavioral choices. The theater outing was psychological therapy disguised as entertainment, proof that he could participate in civilian society despite the brain injury that had ended his military career, but couldn't eliminate his determination to live fully, despite the challenges that combat-related Tourette's created. Most people will understand if they know it's medical, Jake hoped while entering Theater 7 carrying documentation of his disability that few civilians would bother to examine before judging his condition as disruptive behavior requiring correction. His mission was simple: watch a 2-hour movie without incident, demonstrating that wounded veterans could integrate into civilian activities when communities showed basic accommodation and understanding, rather than immediate hostility toward neurological differences they couldn't comprehend. Jake's preparation for public outings included medication timing to minimize tic severity, seating selection to reduce disruption to other patrons, and documentation of his disability status in case managers questioned his right to accommodation under federal law. His approach emphasized proactive communication and education over defensive confrontation, carrying medical letters that explained his combat-related Tourette syndrome, while demonstrating that his condition was legitimate disability rather than behavioral problem requiring discipline. Most critically, Jake prepared psychologically for civilian reactions that ranged from curiosity to hostility, developing coping strategies that maintained his dignity while managing the emotional stress of public discrimination against his sacrifice-induced condition. His military training provided tactical awareness for managing confrontational situations, identify exit routes, assess crowd dynamics, document discriminatory behavior, and maintain composure under hostile conditions that civilians created through ignorance about neurological disabilities. Jake also prepared standard explanations for his condition that balanced medical privacy with educational opportunities, using encounters to improve civilian understanding of combat-related injuries while protecting his right to public accommodation. His theater selection considered acoustics, crowd size, and management reputation for disability accommodation, choosing venues that corporate policies suggested might provide appropriate service for customers with neurological conditions requiring reasonable accommodation rather than ejection. Jake entered Theater 7 during peak evening hours, immediately noticing the 8 Navy SEALs in civilian clothes whose off-duty team bonding was evident through their coordinated seating and relaxed military bearing that only trained eyes could recognize. The SEALs, Senior Chief Peterson Petty Officers Williams, Martinez, and Thompson, and 4 teammates enjoying liberty, were unwinding after training exercises, unaware they were about to witness discrimination against the Marine whose sacrifice had saved SEAL lives during their Afghan deployment. Jake selected an aisle seat that would minimize disruption during tick episodes while providing easy exit access. If his condition required leaving during particularly severe symptom periods that medication couldn't always control effectively. His first tics during movie previews drew immediate attention from nearby patrons who whispered complaints about disruptive behavior, while Jake attempted to manage his neurological symptoms through breathing techniques and positioning strategies. Theater manager Carol Anderson noticed customer complaints through her floor monitoring while observing Jake's involuntary movements and vocalizations that she interpreted as deliberate disruption rather than medical condition requiring accommodation. The SEALs recognized military bearing in Jake's posture despite his obvious neurological challenges, creating situational awareness that would soon prove crucial when civilian intolerance met military understanding of combat-related injuries and their lasting effects. Theater patrons began complaining to management about Jake's vocal tics and involuntary movements, interpreting his neurological symptoms as deliberate disruption rather than medical condition requiring accommodation under federal disability law. "That guy is ruining the movie," whispered patron Sarah Kim to her friend while pointing at Jake's involuntary vocalizations during quiet scenes. Their complaints revealed civilian ignorance about Tourette syndrome while creating hostile environment that transformed medical condition into social problem requiring management intervention. Jake attempted to explain his disability to nearby patrons, but their lack of understanding and continued complaints escalated the situation beyond individual accommodation to management involvement. Manager Carol Anderson approached Jake with obvious authority and minimal understanding of disability rights, demanding explanation for disruptive behavior that other customers found unacceptable during their paid entertainment experience. "Sir, we've received multiple complaints about your loud outbursts and movements," Anderson announced, while treating Jake's neurological condition as behavioral problem requiring correction, rather than medical disability requiring reasonable accommodation. Her approach revealed systematic ignorance about combat-related Tourette syndrome while demonstrating corporate prioritization of complaining customers over disabled individuals' rights. Jake presented his disability documentation, but Anderson's focus remained on customer complaints rather than legal obligations to accommodate neurological conditions. The situation escalated when Anderson demanded Jake leave the theater despite his documentation of combat-related disability, choosing customer appeasement over federal law compliance while demonstrating complete ignorance about military sacrifice and neurological conditions. Other customers paid for quiet movie experience, and your condition is preventing that, Anderson declared, while violating Americans with Disabilities Act requirements for reasonable accommodation. Her ejection order created illegal discrimination that the 8 SEALs witnessed, with growing recognition of the Marine they were watching face civilian ignorance about military-related disabilities that deserved respect rather than expulsion from public entertainment venues. The theater's complaint system prioritized volume of customer dissatisfaction over individual rights protection, creating an environment where Jake's disability faced majority opposition that management interpreted as business justification for discrimination. Nearby patrons continued complaining despite Jake's attempts to explain his medical condition, with some filming his tics for social media mockery, while others demanded refunds if he remained in the theater during their entertainment. Theater security arrived expecting routine ejection of disruptive customer, rather than encounter with disabled veteran whose condition resulted from military service that protected the freedoms they were exercising to discriminate against him. Anderson's supervisor supported her decision through phone consultation that prioritized customer retention over disability compliance, creating corporate liability while demonstrating systematic ignorance about federal accommodation requirements. The 8 SEALs observed the escalating discrimination with growing recognition that civilian management was violating both legal protections and moral obligations toward wounded veteran, whose sacrifice they were beginning to understand through his military bearing. Social media posts about Jake's disruption began appearing as patrons shared videos without context about his disability or military service, creating viral content that would soon transform into education about combat-related neurological conditions. Facing public ejection while managing neurological symptoms tested every lesson military training had taught Jake about maintaining dignity under hostile conditions while advocating for disability rights that extended beyond his individual situation. Anderson's discrimination forced Jake to balance personal accommodation needs against broader veteran advocacy, using his experience to educate civilians about combat-related Tourette syndrome while documenting violations that could protect other disabled veterans. His response to illegal discrimination revealed character developed through military service. He maintained composure despite personal attacks, applied strategic thinking to civilian confrontation, and prioritized mission success, advancing disability rights over personal satisfaction, challenging ignorance directly. The confrontation crystallized Jake's understanding of civilian-military divide. His sacrifice meant nothing to individuals who couldn't recognize neurological disabilities as legitimate medical conditions deserving accommodation rather than elimination. Jake's military identity strengthened under attack, reminding him that his worth came from service to principles larger than civilian comfort, and that his response to discrimination would influence how future disabled veterans were treated by civilian businesses. His Tourette's symptoms paradoxically provided strength through their visibility, creating undeniable evidence of combat-related injury that demanded recognition and accommodation rather than allowing denial of his military sacrifice. As Anderson's ejection order violated federal disability law while dismissing Jake's military service documentation, the situation approached crisis where civilian discrimination would trigger military intervention from witnesses who understood combat-related injuries. Jake's neurological condition made retreat impossible as stress increased his tic frequency, creating more civilian complaints, while his disability prevented the quiet compliance that management demanded for resolution. The 8 SEALs recognized escalating discrimination against wounded veteran while processing their growing certainty that Jake's military bearing and sacrifice-related condition deserved protection rather than ejection from civilian entertainment. Anderson's legal liability increased with each discriminatory statement, while her ignorance about disability rights created corporate exposure that supervisor consultation couldn't minimize through continued violation of federal accommodation requirements. Theater security's preparation for forced ejection created potential for physical confrontation between civilian employees and disabled veteran whose condition would worsen under additional stress from discriminatory treatment. The convergence of disability discrimination, military witnesses, and corporate liability created perfect storm that would transform Jake's quiet movie attempt into education about respecting combat-related neurological conditions and the heroes who developed them, protecting American freedoms. Manager Anderson's discrimination reached its climax when she publicly announced Jake's ejection for continued disruption despite multiple warnings, violating federal disability law while humiliating wounded veteran in front of witnesses who were beginning to understand the true nature of his condition. "Sir, you need to leave immediately or we'll call security to remove you," Anderson declared, while other patrons applauded her decision to prioritize their entertainment over Jake's disability rights and military sacrifice that had created his neurological condition. The situation exploded when Jake attempted final explanation. "Ma'am, this is combat-related Tourette syndrome from an IED blast. I have documentation and legal right to accommodation." His military bearing and specific medical terminology caught the attention of the 8 SEALs who recognized both his service and the discrimination he faced. Anderson's response revealed complete ignorance and callous disregard. "I don't care what caused your condition. Other customers shouldn't have to suffer because of your problems." Her dismissal of military sacrifice while violating disability law created the exact confrontation that federal accommodation requirements were designed to prevent. Jake faced impossible choice: submit to illegal ejection and validate civilian discrimination against disabled veterans, or resist expulsion while his neurological condition worsened under stress that increased tic frequency and provided more ammunition for management's complaints. The 8 SEALs had heard enough civilian discrimination against wounded veteran whose condition they now recognized as combat-related injury, deserving protection rather than persecution from civilians who benefited from his sacrifice without understanding its cost. Senior Chief Peterson made the decision for his team. Military brotherhood required intervention when disabled veterans faced discrimination that violated both legal protections and moral obligations that decent Americans owed those who'd sacrificed for their freedom. Standing in Theater 7 facing illegal ejection while his Tourette's symptoms intensified under discriminatory stress, Jake confronted the fundamental choice between accepting civilian persecution or fighting back in ways that would influence how all disabled veterans were treated. The safe choice was compliance leave, quietly avoid confrontation, and hope that individual education might eventually improve civilian understanding of combat-related disabilities without creating public incident that could attract unwanted attention. But Jake realized that Anderson's discrimination represented systematic problem affecting countless disabled veterans who faced similar treatment from civilians who saw only disruption rather than sacrifice, creating environments where military injuries were penalized rather than accommodated. If I leave without fighting, every disabled veteran will face the same discrimination, Jake thought, while Anderson prepared security intervention that would physically remove him for possessing neurological condition earned through military service. His decision crystallized around military values duty to protect other disabled veterans from discrimination honor that demanded accountability for illegal treatment and service that extended beyond personal comfort to institutional change, benefiting all wounded warriors. The ultimate stakes transcended individual accommodation to involve systematic reform, whether disabled veterans would continue accepting civilian discrimination in silence, or whether federal disability law would finally protect military sacrifice from ignorant persecution by businesses that profited from freedoms such sacrifice preserved. Jake's choice would determine whether Anderson's ignorance became learning experience or continued pattern of discrimination affecting disabled veterans throughout civilian society that benefited from their sacrifice while refusing appropriate accommodation and respect. Jake made the choice that would transform Anderson's discrimination into educational opportunity, stand firm for disability rights, while maintaining dignity that would contrast sharply with management's obvious violation of federal law and basic human decency. Ma'am, your ejection violates the Americans with Disabilities Act and discriminates against combat-related injury, Jake announced with military bearing that commanded attention, while Anderson realized her discrimination had targeted someone who understood legal rights and wouldn't accept persecution quietly. His transformation from accommodating customer to assertive advocate created immediate shift in theater dynamics as patrons began recognizing illegal discrimination, while Anderson's staff started distancing themselves from obviously problematic management decisions. But Jake's assertion of rights created new complications as Anderson's pride prevented acknowledgement of mistakes that were becoming more expensive with every second of continued violation of federal disability law. Security will remove you regardless of whatever laws you think protect your disruptive behavior, Anderson responded, while creating additional evidence of discrimination that federal investigators would use in civil rights case. Jake's patience had ended and his documentation was complete. Anderson's career in customer service management was over, and her discrimination would become case study in the cost of violating disability rights earned through military sacrifice. The 8 Navy SEALs had reached their limit, watching civilian discrimination against Marine whose combat-related Tourette syndrome they now recognized as sacrifice-induced disability, deserving protection rather than persecution from ignorant theater management that violated federal law. Senior Chief Peterson coordinated his team's response with tactical precision. SEALs timed to educate these civilians about respecting wounded warriors. His quiet command activated military brotherhood that transcended service branch rivalries when disabled veterans faced civilian discrimination. The SEALs' synchronized movement from relaxed entertainment posture to military formation created immediate atmospheric change as their coordinated response demonstrated unit cohesion, forged through combat deployments and shared understanding of sacrifice that civilians couldn't comprehend. "Ma'am, we need to discuss your treatment of this Marine," Peterson announced, while approaching Anderson, who continued her illegal discrimination, unaware that her violation of disability rights had attracted attention from witnesses whose authority and knowledge would expose her complete ignorance. The theater fell silent as 8 elite warriors prepared to educate civilian management about federal disability law, military sacrifice, and the meaning of combat-related neurological conditions that deserved accommodation rather than ejection from public entertainment venues. Anderson's confident discrimination was about to meet military reality that would transform her violation into education about respecting wounded veterans whose sacrifice enabled the freedoms she exercised to discriminate against them. The SEALs' approach created immediate tension as Anderson faced 8 men whose obvious military bearing and coordinated movement suggested authority and knowledge that her civilian management training couldn't comprehend or challenge effectively. "Gentlemen, this is private business matter that doesn't concern you," Anderson attempted, while failing to recognize military authority that immediately identified combat veterans whose experience exceeded her understanding of service sacrifice and disability accommodation requirements. Peterson's response carried command authority that demanded attention. "Ma'am, discriminating against wounded Marines concerns every SEAL. This veteran's Tourette syndrome represents combat injury earned protecting American forces, including our teams." Anderson's staff began recognizing the seriousness of situation as 8 SEALs in formation provided testimony about military service, while customers started recording what was obviously becoming educational moment about veteran treatment and disability rights. "I don't know what you're talking about," Anderson protested, while her discrimination faced military witnesses who could articulate exactly why her behavior violated legal, moral, and ethical standards that decent businesses maintained regardless of customer complaints. The theater atmosphere became electric as civilian ignorance prepared to meet military education about respect, sacrifice, and the meaning of neurological conditions earned through combat service that protected American freedoms that Anderson exercised to discriminate against those who preserved them. Senior Chief Peterson began the SEALs' intervention with professional military bearing that immediately established credibility and authority that Anderson's civilian management status couldn't challenge or dismiss through continued discrimination. "Ma'am, I'm Senior Chief Peterson, United States Navy SEALs. The Marine you're ejecting suffers from combat-related Tourette syndrome earned through military service that protected your freedom to discriminate against wounded veterans in this theater." His identification created immediate credibility while establishing context for Anderson's discrimination that transformed her violation from simple business decision to unpatriotic disrespect for military sacrifice that decent Americans couldn't tolerate. That neurological condition didn't come from genetics or accident. Peterson continued while educating Anderson about combat injuries that civilians couldn't understand. It came from IED blasts during military service that saved American lives, possibly including SEAL team members. Anderson's confident discrimination began wavering as military authority challenged her ignorance with facts about service and sacrifice that her civilian experience couldn't refute through continued complaints about customer comfort. The SEAL's testimony created immediate complications for Anderson as her discrimination faced professional military witnesses whose combat experience provided authority that civilian management training couldn't challenge through continued violation of federal law. Petty Officer Williams added personal context. Combat-related Tourette syndrome results from traumatic brain injury during explosive ordnance disposal operations. This Marine's condition represents sacrifice that protected other service members during combat. Anderson attempted damage control. I didn't know it was military-related, but Peterson corrected her misunderstanding. Military service doesn't excuse discrimination. Federal law requires accommodation for neurological disabilities, regardless of their origin or your customer complaints. The SEAL's coordinated testimony demonstrated unit cohesion that civilian employees couldn't understand while creating educational environment where Anderson's ignorance faced systematic correction from qualified authorities whose experience exceeded her corporate training. Petty Officer Martinez provided legal education. Americans with Disabilities Act requires reasonable accommodation for neurological conditions. Your ejection violates federal law while dishonoring military sacrifice that protected your business freedoms. Anderson's discrimination collapsed under military testimony that exposed her ignorance while educating civilian observers about veteran issues and disability rights that protected service members from exactly the treatment she had provided illegally. The climactic revelation occurred when Petty Officer Thompson disclosed that Jake's unit had saved SEAL team members during the Afghanistan deployment, where he sustained his traumatic brain injury, creating personal connection that transformed Anderson's abstract discrimination into specific dishonor of heroic sacrifice. This Marines EOD unit saved 8 SEALs during IED clearing operations in Kandahar province, Thompson announced while providing testimony that proved Jake's disability resulted from protecting Navy personnel rather than genetic misfortune deserving ejection. Anderson's emotional response revealed the impact of learning her discrimination had targeted genuine military hero. I had no idea. But Peterson corrected her understanding. Military sacrifice creates obligations for civilian accommodation regardless of your knowledge about individual service records. The revelation that Jake had literally sacrificed his neurological health protecting SEALs created powerful emotional impact that transcended legal requirements to involve moral obligations that decent Americans maintained toward wounded veterans whose conditions resulted from saving other service members. Those SEALs completed their mission and returned safely because of his sacrifice. Thompson continued while providing context that made Anderson's discrimination obviously unpatriotic and legally indefensible. Jake's response showed military humility. Just doing my job protecting the team. But the SEALs corrected his modesty. Absorbing IED blast to save SEAL lives exceeds duty requirements. Your neurological injury deserves accommodation and respect, not ejection from civilian entertainment. Anderson's discrimination faced complete collapse as sealed testimony established Jake's heroic service while creating educational moment that would influence civilian treatment of disabled veterans throughout the community and corporate entertainment industry. Ma'am, you will immediately accommodate this Marine and provide written apology for illegal discrimination, Peterson commanded while establishing consequences for violation that transcended business policy to involve federal civil rights law. Anderson's attempt at apology revealed genuine remorse. "I sincerely apologize. I didn't understand what his condition represented." Her recognition of Jake's sacrifice created personal transformation from ignorant discrimination to respectful accommodation. The SEAL's education extended beyond individual correction to systematic reform of civilian attitudes toward military sacrifice and disability rights that protected wounded veterans from discriminatory treatment by ignorant business management. Combat-related neurological conditions represent American military medical reality that businesses must accommodate rather than eliminate through customer appeasement. Peterson explained while providing broader context for respecting rather than ejecting disabled veterans. Corporate management arrived to investigate the commotion, immediately recognizing their employees' discrimination had created federal liability, while 8 SEALs provided testimony about illegal treatment of wounded veteran whose sacrifice deserved corporate policy reform. Anderson's education about military sacrifice created immediate policy changes as corporate management implemented disability awareness training, while the SEAL's intervention established new standards for accommodating wounded veterans in civilian entertainment venues. Jake received corporate apology and lifetime movie passes, while Anderson faced disciplinary action and mandatory education about disability rights and military service that would prevent future discrimination. The incident's documentation created national conversation about veteran treatment, while the SEAL's intervention demonstrated military brotherhood that protected disabled veterans from civilian ignorance and illegal discrimination. Most importantly, Anderson's transformation from discriminatory ignorance to respectful accommodation showed how education could overcome prejudice when delivered by qualified authorities who understood military sacrifice and disability law. Anderson's discrimination and subsequent education by 8 Navy SEALs created immediate policy changes at Cineplex Corporation as management implemented mandatory disability awareness training while establishing protocols for accommodating wounded veterans with neurological conditions. The viral video of SEAL intervention attracted national attention to disabled veteran treatment, while Anderson's transformation from ignorant discrimination to respectful accommodation demonstrated how education could overcome civilian prejudice about combat-related conditions. Jake received corporate compensation and public recognition, while the SEAL's intervention established precedent for military personnel protecting disabled veterans from civilian discrimination through education rather than confrontation. National veterans organizations used the incident to create awareness campaigns about accommodating neurological disabilities, while theater chains throughout the country implemented policies specifically designed to serve rather than eject wounded veterans with combat-related conditions. Anderson retained her position after completing extensive disability law training, while becoming advocate for veteran rights and inclusive customer service that recognized sacrifice rather than eliminating neurological differences. 2 years later, Anderson's education became catalyst for nationwide entertainment industry training programs about serving disabled veterans with dignity and respect that accommodated neurological conditions rather than prioritizing customer complaints over federal law. The SEALs' intervention influenced military-civilian relations as their professional education demonstrated how service members could protect wounded veterans while improving civilian understanding of combat-related disabilities and accommodation requirements. Entertainment venues nationwide adopted Operation Accommodation protocols specifically designed for serving disabled veterans, while Anderson's story became training material for customer service managers who worked in communities with military populations. Disability advocacy organizations used the incident to create educational partnerships with entertainment businesses, teaching accommodation standards that respected rather than ejected disabled veterans while complying with federal civil rights law. The case established precedent for military intervention in civilian discrimination cases while demonstrating how unit cohesion extended to protecting wounded veterans from ignorant civilian treatment that violated both legal protections and moral obligations. Jake evolved from discrimination victim to respected advocate whose dignity under attack inspired community support while demonstrating how disabled veterans could maintain honor despite civilian ignorance about combat-related neurological conditions. His Tourette syndrome became symbol of sacrifice rather than disruption as the SEALs' testimony educated the community about combat injuries that represented service rather than behavior requiring elimination. My Tics tell a story of service, not disruption, Jake often explains to civilian audiences. Understanding that story helps communities accommodate sacrifice and show appropriate respect for disabled veterans who continue serving despite their neurological conditions. Jake's story proves that combat-related disabilities deserve civilian accommodation and respect, while Anderson's transformation demonstrates how education can overcome ignorance when delivered by qualified authorities who understand the true meaning of neurological conditions earned through heroic service protecting American freedoms. Epilogue. Today, Jake Mitchell operates the Combat Neurological Support Center near Norfolk Naval Base, where his Tourette syndrome serves as inspiration for newly injured service members, while his story educates civilian businesses about accommodating disabled veterans with dignity and legal compliance. Manager Carol Anderson became the center's first civilian partner, using her experience to train entertainment industry managers about recognizing and accommodating military-related disabilities, rather than ejecting customers whose conditions represent heroism. The theater seat, where Jake was nearly ejected, now bears a plaque honoring military brotherhood that protects disabled veterans, while Cineplex Corporation's nationwide training program uses Anderson's transformation as proof that education can overcome ignorance when qualified military personnel take time to explain the true meaning of neurological conditions earned through combat service. Senior Chief Peterson and his SEAL team continue their service while knowing their intervention that day changed not just one manager's understanding, but an entire industry's approach to serving those who sacrificed neurological health to protect American freedoms that civilians enjoy daily without understanding their true cost or the heroes who paid that price through brain injuries that became permanent reminders of service above self-deserving accommodation rather than ejection from the entertainment venues their sacrifice was meant to preserve for all Americans.